We're very happy to have Robert Pickard talking to us this evening.
This is not my favorite medium for interaction. I much prefer a living audience that I can interact with, because talks are not supposed to be monologues. There's supposed to be a dialogue between the people in the audience and the people speaking. And I find that terribly important. Otherwise, you're talking about something and you can't tell whether the audience are following you or not. However, I will sail on with this technological marvel. Nutrition science is all about atoms. It's all about studying how plants, animals, and human beings can gather together to consume the atoms that their genes require to build the molecules that the genes are specified to build. That's the essence of nutrition. It also includes, of course, getting sufficient oxygen to run the system and getting sufficient energy to run the system. So if we move on now, just to remind you that the Central Association of Beekeepers tries to bring together the art of beekeeping and the science of beekeeping, and to put science at the center of beekeeping for an honest and truthful future. I was tempted to call this talk Nutrition in Honeybees and Their Keepers, or Beekeepers and Their Keepers. Because in essence, I've concentrated on the people most likely to be beekeepers at the present time. I always like to start off at the beginning. So here we are now, 14 billion years ago, looking out towards the center of the universe, the known universe, and there's no solid matter whatsoever. There's just a black hole sitting at the center. And it's really a star, but its gravitational field is so strong that light cannot escape from it. But it's really a ball of energy. And 14 billion years ago, it exploded for very understandable reasons of physics, that the center was hotter than the exterior, and the exterior was providing a straitjacket. So as the center tries to expand, of course, an explosion is inevitable. And what we see now is a cloud of hydrogen, the smallest atom in the universe and the most abundant atom. Atoms, as you know, are produced in stars, or at least atoms up to the size of iron are produced in stars. Atoms that are bigger than iron will need to be produced with some radioactive influence in, for example, a neutron star or some other radioactive situation. Because if you try to push two iron atoms together to make a bigger atom in nuclear fusion, you won't have any energy left over to drive the nuclear fusion. So here we get the first atom being produced. I always like to say at this point that this is not the beginning of creation. This is not the beginning of existence, because all the energy that was necessary to build this universe was already in existence before the Big Bang took place. And since energy can neither be created nor destroyed, we can only assume that existence itself is an infinite thing. That gives me quite a lot of comfort, because it probably means there's no such thing as an original event, neither a birth nor a death. If you have the infinity to produce a universe, spread out all the energy, and then suck it all back together again at the end of the process into a nice little black hole where you can start the whole process again. So, of course, gravity exerted its influence on the hydrogens and pulled them all together to produce galaxies. And that happened very quickly. And these clouds of hydrogen gas then start to draw together under the influence of gravity to produce stars. If we traveled out from our planet 2.5 million years at the speed of light, we could look back on our planet, and this is the sort of picture that we would see. We would see our galaxy, the Milky Way, and we would see our solar system at this point in the disk of the galaxy. Now, it's interesting that at the Big Bang, none of the atoms were made that are needed to build a honeybee or a human being. But 5 billion years ago, a supernova exploded at this point in the Milky Way galaxy, and that generated all the atoms that you need to basically put together honeybees and human beings, all the way up to iron. And then some other larger atoms have been brought in from other sources. But from 5 billion years on, there were no new atoms created in our part of the galaxy. And that's why all atoms have to be circulated. So speed of light is 186,000 miles a second. So you can see that you had to travel a very long way away to get this picture of the Milky Way galaxy. This is one of my favorite sort of slides from student days. And I'm sitting in Charles Darwin's chair in his house, in Down House, where he spent the latter part of his life. And this is the chair in which he wrote his famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And I was dreaming right at that point of all the different things that could have occurred between the explosion of our local star 5 billion years ago and the complete evolutionary sequence that's taken place since. Here's a typical sort of countryland scene that you might see on a David Attenborough program. And here you can see the atoms that honeybees and human beings need, and they're all being cycled. Phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It's amazing to think that 4/5 of the world's atmosphere is composed of nitrogen, but we can't get it, nor could a honeybee. We need that nitrogen to be fixed by a bacterium, a nitrogen fixing bacterium in the soil, to convert it to nitrate. And once it's converted to nitrate, it's water soluble, and the plants can suck it up through their roots, and then we and the honeybees can exploit the plants to obtain the amino acids that we need to build our proteins. So this is just one example of the importance of bacteria in our lives. They were the first forms of life, along with the archaea, almost 4 billion years ago. And the process of evolution that led to honeybees and human beings is about 2,500 million years old. But nothing survives on this planet without the microorganisms, and the bacteria are, in many ways, the significant representative of the microorganisms. Now, every animal and every plant and every microorganism is a food for another plant, another microorganism, or another animal. And that's the way in which the atoms are being circulated around the ecological system. And that's why diversity is so important. If you destroy the diversity, you risk the future of humankind, as well as, of course, of honeybees. The honeybee sits as a key point as one of the major pollinators of the world and supports a huge number of plants, animals, and microbes. It's not just the plants that the bee pollinates, it's all the mammals that are feeding on the fruit and all the insects that are feeding on the fruit. And then when those plants die, it's all the microorganisms and fungi that are feeding on those plants. So the number of species that is supported by the activities of the honeybee is far, far greater than simply the flowers that a honeybee pollinates. If we look around the hillside, we'll see some human food sources. So here we've got the sheep in the uplands, And then we've got cows in the meadows, and we've got pigs in the woodland. These three animals provide the richest source of food for human beings. It's the most nutritious. It contains amino acids in the right balance of proportionality for building human proteins. And of course, there's a full range of vitamins and minerals in the lean red meat of these animals. But I don't advocate that if you eat these animals in your diet, you don't need to eat much. 2 ounces a week will give you all your vitamins and minerals from lean red meat. And lean red meat, of course, is preferable than fatty meat, because nowadays we don't do much work to obtain our food, and therefore it's better to eat lean red meat rather than red meat with a lot of fat on it. But you only need a small quantity. You may ask then, why do you need vegetable material at all? The main contribution that vegetable material makes is in non-digestible fiber. Without that non-digestible fiber, our bodies don't work very well, our gut in particular. So really, the balanced diet for humans is 2/3 of the food coming from animal sources, including, of course, shellfish and fish and birds, not just mammals. And then 2/3 will come from plant life. So just to remind us now that cows, sheep, and pigs share 80% of their genes with humans. So it's not surprising that their food, their muscles, are so particularly nutritious for humans, because cows, sheep, and pigs have to produce many of the same molecules that we have to produce. You'll be surprised to know that honeybees share 60% of their genes with human beings. Which surprised me at the time it was discovered, because I expected them to be a little further away from us in the evolutionary tree. So it's quite remarkable that all the basic chemistry in a honeybee is the same or very similar to the basic chemistry in a human being, because we shared a common ancestor, which was a long time ago, before the origination of the arthropods. As a consequence of that, we've had some studies in Europe in nutrition comparing the nutritional value of beef, chicken, pork, and honeybee. And you'll be interested to see here that honeybee gets the highest United Nations nutritional score compared with beef, chicken, and pork. So I won't be surprised if honeybee larvae are being reared in 2050, and whilst they're still larvae, mature larvae, being dried and then powdered and then used to create all sorts of proteinaceous foods. And if it's not honeybees, it will certainly be crickets and other insect sources. So just to check up on the contribution of the bacteria, we're all familiar with chloroplasts in green plants, fixing sunlight energy and creating the molecule glucose. And it's only recently we've come to understand that the chloroplast is a symbiotic bacterium. It contains DNA, bacterial DNA, and replicates independently of its host and divides with binary fission. So here's the wonderful, almost miraculous molecule glucose, which is the product, key product of the photosynthesis in a green plant. But once you've put the energy into this molecule with a bacterium, you really need a bacterium to get the maximum amount of energy out of it. And that brings in the mitochondria. So you'll find mitochondria in honeybees and in human beings in almost every cell in the body. These are, again, symbiotic bacteria, and they contain bacterial DNA, and they reproduce by binary fission. So I think my wife is quite pleased when I remind her that when she produced her eggs to produce our offspring, she put her human DNA into the nucleus. But she also did something else that was very critical. She inoculated the cytoplasm of her egg with mitochondrial bacteria. thereby providing the unborn child with the batteries that it needs for survival. The female honeybee does exactly the same thing. Her genetic material goes into the nucleus of the egg, and the mitochondrial bacteria go into the cytoplasm. So when we breathe in oxygen, it travels to the mitochondrion, as it does in honeybees. And in the sugar molecule, you see all these hydrogen atoms which are clipped off in the digestive process and transported to the mitochondrion. And in the mitochondrion, the hydrogen is oxidized to produce hydrogen oxide, which of course is water. And in that process, there's a huge amount of energy released chemically, which is stored in this molecule, adenosine triphosphate, which then travels around the honeybee and around the human being, delivering energy as required to power different reactions. So you couldn't have a clearer demonstration that we are essentially totally dependent upon our bacterial partners for our survival. Here is a mitochondrion, and here you can see the bacterial DNA. And the enzymes that handle the oxygen are lined up here. There's also a very important chemical process in the mitochondrion called the Krebs, tricarboxylic acid cycle. And those of you that have studied chemistry will know that the Krebs cycle is absolutely essential for life, for a human being and for a honeybee. And it's taking place in the mitochondria. Just for comparison, I put in a SARS virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus at the same magnification. And I've also added a sac brood virus. There are 4 of them here. So you can see how tiny these viruses are that influence honeybee life, even when compared with a bacterium or a bacterium that a symbiotic bacterium like the mitochondrion. And we're looking here in units of nanometers, and a nanometer is a millionth of a millimeter. So these are so tiny. It's amazing that we're able to study them as well as we can. Well, energy is a real problem for human beings because we don't have to do much work now to get a lot of energy. You see 2 squares of chocolate, 18 grams, will give you 100 calories of energy, and 3 carrots will give you the same 100 calories. And if you want to get rid of 100 calories, you can mountain bike for 30 minutes, or I like this one, you can watch television for 39 minutes. You could even sleep for 91 minutes and you get rid of 100 calories. But of course, there isn't enough time in the day to sleep away your calories, and you've got to do something more active if you want to avoid accumulating energy. If you're accumulating energy, then of course you will gradually become obese because the input of energy is greater than the output. This is one of the really important experiments that was done at Oxford by Keith Frayne and his group. And here you see a group of volunteers who have agreed to have their arteries and veins in their abdomen that run to the fat body, connected up to machinery that will measure the fatty acids in flow in the blood and the presence of insulin. And they were fed 100 grams of carbohydrate and 33 grams of fat. And look what happened. As soon as that went into the mouth, insulin was released from the pancreas. And as soon as insulin was released, the enzymes that were breaking down the fat in the abdomen stopped working, and the abdominal fats went down. This is because the body knows what time of day it is. It's got a history of past activity, which it has memorized in the lower regions of the brain. And when food is coming in, it doesn't want to waste, it stores. So it releases insulin in preparation for free glucose appearing in the bloodstream, and it stops all breakdown of stores. So it's almost impossible to lose weight and still keep putting food in your mouth. Even if you put in a a sweet drink of orange juice and spit it out afterwards, it will be too late. The breakdown of fat will have been stopped and the insulin will have been released. So really, the best way to lose weight is with intermittent fasting, where you just put plain water into your mouth and no objects that will be interpreted by the brain as sources of food. And then you have a chance of keeping your fat breakdown continuing. This was a nice result from Frayn's work, because it showed that if you give the same meal at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, if you at breakfast, about 15% of that meal will be stored. So most of it will be used during the day. But if you eat the same meal at lunchtime, 35% will be stored. And if you eat the same meal in the evening, 45% will be stored. So it definitely supports the dietitian's recommendations that your breakfast should be your biggest meal and you should avoid eating in the evening. And this is all because the brain realizes that it's not going to use this energy in the evening, and so it switches on the storage process and you get more fat. So we can't take our brains for granted. Intermittent fasting, just the odd day here and there where you give your body a chance to get rid of the fat and you don't put anything of a substantial nature into your mouth, just clean fresh water, and extend the sleeping period so that you can make it a bit longer in terms of fasting. So you can have your breakfast a little bit later and you can have your evening meal a little bit earlier. And then you will lose weight under that regime. Luckily, we've got our politicians to help us to steer a way through this. And here you see George. And George is looking through some binoculars, but he's forgotten to take the caps off. So he can't see anything, but he doesn't tell anyone that he can't see anything. This is a very clear example that politics is the art of government and it's not the science of government. And we want our politicians to really gather more scientific information and to derive their policy from the evidence. George here is fully concerned with the photo shot. He's not concerned with the truth of the situation. And we want our politicians to deal in truth. And that will make a great difference to our future. Well, one of the casualties of Varroa arriving in the United Kingdom was that a lot of brawler seeker parasitic flies that live with honeybees were killed. So here is brawler seeker, and there's its foot, beautiful, adapted to move over the surface of the honeybee. And here's the head. And this fly used to be like a housefly. It had wings and it had a really complex brain. But when you look at the brain now, it's very, very simple. The eyes have disappeared and the antennae just remain as dipter and antennae in little sockets in the head of the fly. And we have to ask the question, if this fly has lived for millions of years with the honeybee, why was it so important for the honeybee to develop an accepting behavior? And why was it so important to the fly to give up all its freedom and become totally dependent on a honeybee colony? Now, here's a little film of Varroa feeding on a honeybee. And I put 3 brawler on the back of this bee. And in a minute, we'll see one of the brawler come forward and she'll come down to the mouth parts and she will assiduously clean the mouth parts. In human beings, the health of the mouth is directly proportional to systemic health. And dietitians have pointed this out for many, many years. And that's because of the amount of bacteria that you can accumulate in the mouth. It provides a very easy access to the body. And here you can see this fly is completely cleaning the mandibles of not just wax, but sticky products from propolis and resins. and it's removing all the bacteria at the same time around the mouth. So it's actually performing a very important service. And this isn't an accident, because if the brawler runs over the eye here, the bee will sweep off the brawler. But if, obviously, because that's what it would do with a mite like Varroa. But if the brawler comes exactly between the antennae down to the mouth, then the bee immediately accepts it. She palpates it. So when a honeybee is really interested in something, it palpates with the ends of the antennae, which of course are highly modified legs. And this is like applying its fingertips of its ancient legs to the back of the brawler. It's actually petting the brawler and encouraging it while it stays there. If it didn't want the brawler to be there, it could sweep its legs across its face and knock the brawler off. But it doesn't do. It even cleans its antennae so it can get a better reception of what the brawler's doing. And you'll see that when the brawler's finished, the bee actually exercises her mandibles, just as we would if we'd had a good massage and we wanted to flex our muscles afterwards. So let's watch this unique piece of natural history. It's about to palpate the fly now. There she goes. It's a very quick action, but she taps. There she goes. She's palpating the surface of the fly. And you notice that she's not alarmed in any way. The antennae are not in the alarm position. You can tell a lot about what a bee is thinking by watching its movements. And you'll see it's the brawler that breaks off the relationship, not the bee. She could crush this fly with her mandibles if she wanted to, as Apis cerana does with Varroa mites. So she has to go back the way she came down, and she does it very quickly. There she goes. And the bee now exercises her mandibles to check that they're all working nice. It's a fascinating thing, that, and one wonders what the consequences are of the fact that we've killed so many brawler across the country. Now here's some dental plaque from a human mouth, just to give you an idea of the bacteria that are present in dental plaque. Huge numbers and many, many different species. Here's the gut of the bee that we can see very clearly, filled in pink. And in the ventriculus here, we've got many species of bacteria. It's important to recognize that the space, the volume of the cavity between the mouth and the anus of a human being and a honeybee is not part of the human being or the honeybee. It's part of the environment. So everything that's pink here is part of the environment, but it's been enclosed by the bee so that it can improve its control of the chemistry of digestion. And that's why so many organisms can live in here, to create a biome, an ecosystem within the gut. In the human gut, the colon, we have more than 400 species of microorganisms. And many of the things that they are doing, of course, are producing nutrients that we absorb from the gut. And the same thing is happening here with the honeybee. So if you look in here, you'll get 20 very common species, which include lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, which are the two most beneficial groups of organism that we get in the human colon. Not surprisingly, of course, they're supplied by milk to babies, and that helps to ensure that their gut runs properly. And it denies access to the gut to some bacteria that may be more damaging. Bees don't connect the midgut to the hindgut until the last larva has completed its growth, the last larval instar. Excuse me. The reason for that, of course, is that the honeybee evolved from a parasitic wasp, which used to lay its eggs inside caterpillars. And it was very important that the caterpillar the wasp larva didn't defecate when it was inside its caterpillar, because it was feeding on the caterpillar. And honeybees have used that property to very great benefit, because when the larva goes into its pupal stage, the midgut is attached to the hindgut, and the feces can then be expelled as for the whole larval development as the pupa is established. I think it's sometimes referred to as a meconium in that situation. And the fecal material is left trapped outside the cocoon, between the cocoon and the wax cell wall. And that keeps it nicely protected from infecting the next larva that will be placed in the cell. There is also a proventricular valve here at the beginning of the ventriculus, which is like a barnacle. It's got hairs on it which sweeps through the liquid in the crop and purifies the liquid. It pulls particles and pollen into the ventriculus, and as a result purifies the nectar in here, which the bee can then regurgitate to use for producing honey. Here's one of the organisms that you'll find in a honeybee gut. It's Lotmaria passim. It's a trypanosome by nature, a beautiful, elegant creature. One of the interesting things is that several scientists have now been able to show that the nest mate recognition characteristics of a honeybee are influenced by the bacteria and microorganisms that it carries in its gut. And because all the bees in a particular colony are exchanging food and occasionally mopping up one another's feces, they're all gradually carrying the same ecological population from their gut. And that seems to produce compounds that travel to the outside of the bee's body and give it its characteristic colony identity. So that's really interesting, that nutrition should play a part in generating the nest mate recognition chemistry. So here we've got queen larvae developing, and we have to remind ourselves, almost pinch ourselves, to realize that a worker and a queen are produced from exactly the same genome. So the food that has been fed to the larvae is influencing the expression of the genes. And if the larva gets royal jelly throughout its early life, then it will develop into a queen. But if after a couple of days more carbohydrate is brought in, it will develop into a worker. So here you have an example of food molecules changing the expression of genes. And we're only just beginning to understand this in human beings. We're now beginning to identify certain molecules that can inhibit the expression of genes. And that will be really important because they're ordinary food molecules. And it will be really important to understand them, because we may be able to then correct some genetic malformations in human beings by using food molecules to switch genes on and off. So again, the honeybee is leading the way in terms of the capability that it has to manipulate a genome to produce two totally different organisms. The queen is completely different to the worker in terms of its behavior and so many structures. I've been all over the hairs on a queen's body, and they are so different to the hairs on a worker body, even though they look the same. When you check out the nervous system underneath the hairs, you find it can be very different. I think one point that I should say at this point is that when honeybees larvae were fed with sterilized pollen, many of the larvae died, and the ones that didn't die had inhibited growth. So this is really important because it means that when we test garden chemicals and agricultural chemicals, it's very important that we test them not just on worker bees, but on queen bees, drone bees, and bee larvae. Because these bee larvae, they originated from a carnivorous wasp. They don't have a natural chemistry for digesting plant material, just as we don't. We evolved from a carnivorous ancestor, and we don't have any enzyme that can break down cellulose, which is a key component of plant material and gives you access to the nutrients in the plant. And the same is true of the honeybee. Unless the pollen is mixed with the right types of fungus, you can't get the beginnings of the fermentation of many of the plant molecules. And then the honeybee larva can't get its nutrients. So the honeybee is relying on a relationship with the fermenting microorganisms to be able to access its nutrients. And that's something that we didn't know or understand for a very long time. Now, if we look in a summer forager, we get this rather blank appearance with very few fat bodies. But if we look in a bee that's going to survive the winter, we see these big fat bodies. And it's these fat bodies that are being destroyed by varroa mites on the surface of the bee. And they act in the same way as liver acts in a human being. They're chemical factories. And if you want to check if your bees will survive the winter, just dissect 2 or 3 of them out going into the winter, and you'll see whether or not they've got these developed fat bodies. If they haven't got these developed fat bodies, they're very unlikely to survive the winter. The main constituent in these fat bodies is vitellogenin, which is a protein which combines fats, carbohydrates, and proteins all in one supermolecule. And you'll also find that there are insulin-like peptides surrounding these molecules in the fat bodies. So we don't yet know whether the insulin story in humans is repeated with insulin-like peptides in bees, but that's going to be a very interesting area of research. Now, if you read a journal, you get the impression that if 1 gram of something does you good, 10 grams of it will give you 10 times the benefit. But that's not true. The real relationship between food and health is like this. The first little bit of a vitamin or a mineral has a huge benefit, but then every additional quantity has less and less benefit until in the end it starts to kill you. This is true for oxygen, it's true for water, and it's true for every vitamin and mineral. So a little bit of everything and not too much of any one thing is the important requirement in a diet. If you get too much of one thing and it's been contaminated in some way, like tuna contaminated with methyl mercury from the Sea of Japan, then of course you're going to make your family extremely ill if you eat nothing but tuna. So it's terribly important just to eat a little bit of everything and not too much of any one thing. We can work out exactly what the nutrition requirements are for every person of every age of every gender and of every ethnicity. And here I've taken an 8-year-old girl as my example. And you'll see that the quantities are all very small, thousandths of a gram, or micrograms here, millionths of a gram. They're all very small quantities. So the important thing is to make sure you've got them present, and the damage occurs when they're not present at all. And we can identify which ones an 8-year-old girl needs to look at very carefully. And then we've got the amino acids, and there are more than 20 amino acids that honeybees and humans need to build their proteins, but some are very critical because most proteins contain a lot of different amino acids. And if when the gene has sent out an instruction to build a protein, one of the amino acids is in short supply, that blocks the whole production of the protein. So lysine is a critical amino acid in human beings. If you don't have lysine, you cannot build most of your proteins. A plant like maize doesn't have any lysine in it at all. So you'll be very badly advised to eat nothing but maize in your diet. And of course, the sulfur amino acids, cysteine and methionine, these are really important, not only because they provide important contributions in their own right, it's the sulfur in cysteine that is replaced by selenium. And there are 26 proteins in the human body that can't be built without selenium. And they use a selenium modified cysteine amino acid. If we look at a typical British honey, it's really interesting to see that there are always amino acids in a typical British honey, and yet you won't find many amino acids in the nectar from a flower. These have been contributed by the fact that the bee has been collecting honeydew from aphids. So don't automatically try to exterminate all the aphids in your garden, because they're a huge benefit to the honeybee. The honeybee is collecting a huge quantity of amino acids from honeydew and some organic acids, some vitamins, and some minerals. So if we just look at this here, lysine, I've already said it, that's critical, rate limiting amino acid for human beings. And there's methionine, a sulfur containing amino acid which can be used for selenium delivery. And you'll also notice glucose oxidase here. And this enzyme that's added to the honey by the bees will act on the glucose to produce hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide is a terrific cleansing agent that we use in hospitals to clean the surfaces of tables and beds and things. And bacteria really do not like hydrogen peroxide. It's almost like a biologically acceptable bleach. And by putting it in the honey, the bees are protecting the honey from surface activation of invading bacteria. If we look at the balanced diet in a human, there's a basic balanced diet and there's a balanced diet for losing weight. So this is the balanced diet for losing weight. 54% of the food is coming from these plants: stems, leaves, flowers, and fruits. Don't be confused by fruits. In many ways, sometimes I wish the fruits were presented with the others, because a fruit is a deception perpetrated on an animal by a plant. The fruit is made to look good and it has a few sugars added to it, but the purpose of the fruit is to encourage the animal to eat the fruit and then distribute the seeds with its feces miles away from the parent plant. And just before a fruit matures, the plant pulls back all its nutrients into the stems and the leaves and the base of the fruit, which used to be the flower. So if you're really looking for nutrients from plants, consider stems and leaves. From fruits, you're going to get some sugars, you're going to get some vitamin C, You're going to get some fiber from dates, pineapple, but you're not going to get the range of nutrients that you would get in stems and leaves. The other thing that needs to be cut down is, of course, potatoes, cereals, bread and pasta, because they contain starch, and starch is pure glucose. A starch molecule is just a row of glucose molecules attached to one another. So eating starch is just like eating bowls of sugar, and you're just piling in energy that your body doesn't need. The milk is important because you get the lactobacilli and the bifidobacteria, which are important for our gut biome. And of course, these proteins, such as fish and meat and eggs, have a terrific balance of amino acids that matches the requirements of the human body. So here we've got all the mixture of pollens that you can knock off a bee's legs as it comes back to the hive. And you see it's a terrific mixture. So as long as bees have got a mixture of pollen and the pollen hasn't been sterilized in any way, and therefore has fermenting yeasts on it, then it will be an excellent food, providing proteins, lipids, some organic acids and some vitamins to the larva. If you look at a sample of pollen for identifying in a honey, a British honey, you can see the evidence that the bee has been to honeydew. These are pine pollen grains, and pine is pollinated by wind. So they've not been collected from the pine tree by the bee. They've flown through the air and stuck on the leaves to the honeydew produced by the aphid, and the bee has collected it. And you also see these little spots of marks of, they could be soot or dirt, which also stick to the surface of the leaf where the aphids are feeding. This is dandelion pollen, and this will be white clover pollen here. So just by looking at a microscope slide of the honey that you're producing, you can work out whether the bees are going to honeydew or not. And if they are going to honeydew, you've got a more nutritionally balanced product than if the bees were only going to flower nectar. And of course, we can identify these. I've got 243 species of plant being visited by the bees in my garden. This large triangular shaped pollen grain you'd find on rosebay willow herb, Epilobium angustifolium. You'd find it on Ipomea. This is morning glory, which is a very beautiful flower. Hollyhocks, Sildalcia. The sunflower, Helianthus. And this reticulated exene is particularly true of lilies. And here you've got Ricinus, the castor oil bean pollen. So just by, these have all been artificially colored on the photograph so that you can see how alike similar pollen grains are from the same plant. It's a wonderful thing to do, and I would recommend every beekeeping association to encourage at least one person in the association to identify pollen grains in honey so they can get the advice whether or not to move their hives closer to a particular source at a particular time of year. And bees also collect propolis, which is full of fascinating compounds that are nutritionally very important, phytonutrients and antibacterial substances that have been produced by trees to close their wounds. And the bees have collected that so that they can patch it around the hive to close up any cracks in the hive. It's called propolis, of course, from the Greek, because polis is city, and propolis means before the city. And originally, when propolis was described, it was found as a little protective umbrella inside the entrance of a colony to protect the colony from bad weather. Well, coming to an end now, I'm in my booklet that will go with this talk. I will summarize all the important considerations for each of these life stages in human life. You see, Shakespeare sums up the aging process very nicely. This is one of his sonnets. Time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth. Nothing stands but for his scythe to mow, and yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel. So in the booklet, I'll give a little explanation of what to look for in the diets of each of these groups. And we can end with a couple of summaries. My advice to honeybees nutritionally is to be locally adapted, to build your colony away from other bees and live on new comb with plenty of space. New comb will not carry bacteria to infect the new brood. And that's why queens prefer to lay their eggs on brand new comb, and workers prefer to put their honey in old comb so it seals in the bacterial diseases of previous generations. By foraging on a wide range of flower species, the honeybee gets the maximum opportunity to gather all the vitamins and minerals that it requires and the complete nutritional requirement. We've talked a lot about honeydew and propolis. Again, it needs to come from diverse sources. Then you've got to have seasonal continuity of forage. And the most important thing for wintering bees is to winter them on their own honey. If you winter them on their own honey, they get not just exactly the right nutrients to feed on, but they also get examples of potentially pathological organisms that they can build some immunity up against during the winter months. If you overwinter on just a sugar solution of sucrose and water, you're really doing your bees a significant disservice. So when I take honey from my colonies, I will make sure that they've got 30 to 40 kilos to survive the winter. And then the rest I'll take for myself. So the key thing is to make sure you leave your bees enough honey to get through the winter, because that will a lot of the argument that goes on about overwintering colonies and colonies suffering death unexpectedly. Bees don't die usually of disease in the winter months. They die of starvation because they weren't set up correctly at the beginning of the winter. And then they've been deprived of all their honey stores if the beekeeper has been relatively unfeeling about the situation and just replaced all their honey with sucrose syrup, which is not a good idea. And then lastly, societal support is really important to bees. And Remy Chauvin showed many, many years ago that if you cage bees in different numbers, their life expectancy is proportional to the number of bees you cage them with. And I thought that was a lovely demonstration of how bees support one another and motivate one another to stay alive. When I define human beings as herding animals aspiring to become social, people ask me for examples of the difference between a herding animal and a social animal. And I give them the example that when bees run out of food, they share the food out to the last individual and they all die together. That doesn't happen with herding animals. And lastly, what about humans at over 60 years of age? Choose your parents extremely carefully. And if you haven't been able to choose them, the genetic influence is so great that every parent should try to discuss with their children the illnesses they've had and the drugs that have worked for them and the drugs that haven't. And in that way, they'll prepare their children for some of the problems of old age. You eat little bits of every food and not too much of any one food. You have an annual blood test because what you're eating may not necessarily be absorbed into your body. Vitamin B12 is a classic example where if you're not absorbing it properly, it won't appear in your bloodstream, but you could have a lot of it in your diet. So the annual blood test is really important because absorption of vitamins and minerals diminishes after the age of 60. You have to drink alcohol sparingly. because yeast produce alcohol to kill their enemies, and their enemies are living cells. And we only manage not to poison ourselves on a regular basis because we have a fantastic chemical system for defending us from alcohol. And the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase can break up hundreds of thousands of alcohol molecules in a single second. But to build alcohol dehydrogenase, you need in your diet 2 atoms of zinc per molecule. So I always say to people that if you're drinking more than 1 glass of wine a week, make sure you have zinc in your diet. Maintaining a healthy mouth and anus is extremely important because these are the points where you get a huge weakness in terms of defense against infection. Being mentally and physically active is really important, and that's why it's really rewarding to become a member of the Central Association of Beekeepers. Because here we try to be active beekeepers, we try to be good beekeepers, and we try to know what's going on in the scientific world. And that's the thing that's most noticeable within the membership of the Central Association. You then have to be motivated so you can get out of bed. And like the honeybees, you have to enjoy societal support from family and friends. So I'm left now back balancing the input and the output of nutrients in the body, which is the key to good health. And I have to say that it's not the path that we choose in life that determines our health and our happiness. It's the way that we walk it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert, for that talk. If there's any questions, feel free to ask them. We've got a few minutes.
I'd like to ask Robert about ATP.
Oh, yes.
I eat a lot of, I eat more than 30 different plants a week. And I feel that the ATP, the energy giving to the rest of my body, is very important. How can I improve it?
Well, I presume your mitochondria are working very well. That's the first thing. And as long as the mitochondria are working very well, you then, of course, need to make sure your lungs are working very well, because the cavities within the lungs, like the gut, are not part of you. They are part of the environment. And if the lungs are not being properly looked after and kept clear and clean, then you won't absorb the oxygen that you need. And without the oxygen, the mitochondria cannot produce the ATP that it's capable of producing.
Thank you.
Robert, thank you, lovely talk. I just wanted to query or comment on, you showed some slides from Frayne et al.
Yes.
The effect of the meal AM, midday, PM. I know that's been accepted for a long time, but I thought the work that's been done in the Zoe group was questioning that now, and that the latest results, because these nutrition results are very, very difficult to do.
Yes.
I thought that they were concluding that that was not so clear cut. Breakfast isn't necessarily the important one, and that those results simply didn't hold water now. They do seem to go along with the 1 or 2 days, not necessarily fasting, but taking in low levels of calories seems to be very good. But the timing and the size of the meals seems to have, in the latest Zoe studies with Tim Spector, very little impact at all. Could you comment on that?
Well, I was very impressed with Keith Frayne's methodology because he wasn't estimating things from random blood samples. He actually had catheters in the arteries and the veins of the people that had volunteered to be studied. And his results and his experimental protocol seemed to me to be very reliable. And the experimental protocol seemed to be extremely well executed. Now, I don't know the latest details that might have come out of the study that you're referring to. But now you've mentioned it, Pam, I'll do a little bit of research and see what they're saying to compare.
They've done a huge number of these studies recently with pretty hefty numbers of people, but I find sometimes they're very difficult to interpret.
They are. What I would say about Keith's study is because he cannulated the blood vessels, it was very positive and very direct. An awful lot of other studies in this area are based on random sampling of large numbers of people where the variation is so high that it's really difficult to tie down the relationships.
When was that work done?
Oxford.
When?
Oh, when? Crikey, some time ago now. It will be 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I have seen Keith recently, well, not recently, but since then. And he was very pleased to tell me that he'd bought a large lawnmower for his wife, which was one of those pushing types, because he wanted to make sure that she was as fit as possible for as long as possible.
I do like the fact that you said at the end, which is what I think most of the nutrition things now land up saying, a little bit of everything, no excesses and no imbalances. In other words, a little bit of what you fancy does you good.
Well, there's no doubt about that. I had the good fortune to be chief executive at the British Nutrition Foundation when Elsie Widdowson was just coming to the end of her term as president. And Elsie is generally recognized by all nutrition experts as the doyenne of the nutrition world. She did so many experiments on herself, with her partner, Robert Pickard, taking the measurements because she thought it was unethical to do so many experiments like injecting yourself with aluminium every day. So she did all the experiments on herself, and she wrote a wonderful book with McCann's. And I said to her one day, she died in her 90s, I said, what do you recommend then, Elsie, after a lifetime of nutrition research at Cambridge? And she said, you eat a little bit of everything, not too much of any one thing, and everything with a glass of milk.
Dare I ask, you haven't mentioned the dreaded vegan diet.
Yes.
What are your views on that?
Well, the law courts have decided that veganism is more akin to a religion.
Yes.
And we have a precedent in law now that when people make a case that is dependent upon a vegan policy or vegan position, because it's so far removed from real science, that it should be treated as, in a sense, some sort of ritualistic ideology of a special interest group. Human beings are omnivores.
Yes.
They're dedicated omnivores. If you look at the teeth, you can see that we have teeth.
But you can't tell vegans that.
No, you can't.
They just don't accept it.
Because
I
they
think
have
what worries me is that nobody in power, I mean, they've had no discussions, and you hear medics coming on, and they won't even answer clearly, would you bring up a small child with a vegan? And they simply say, well, you can buy supplements. I find that terribly sad.
Yes, it's
to bring
children,
up children is so wrong.
Children would suffer significantly under an extreme vegan regime. But you can get away with basic veganism provided you add some eggs and some fish.
Oh yes, but you can't. No, not if you're vegan. That's wicked.
Yes, it's only wrong when it becomes a zealous man.
Well, the world, and yet I think only middle class people could afford it. Working class people with a family and a low income, they can't buy the avocados. Avocados are terribly important with the vegan diet. They can't buy all these things. And the winter, I don't know how they could get a balanced diet if they're not going to eat milk and eggs and cheese at least.
Yeah, you can't deny your ancestry, and we have to put up with the body that our ancestors bequeathed to us. And at the moment, it requires an omnivorous diet.
Yes.
Vitamin B12 can't be found in ordinary plants.
No.
In the diet. You'd have to get it from a microbiological source or
Yes.
from any of the major animal foods. There are lots of molecules that we don't know about that are supplied by animal foods, and we've yet to learn about them and their importance. So anyone who wants to be a vegan, I would say to them, can you modify your position to be a vegetarian, but include eggs and fish in your diet? Just small
I
quantities.
wonder what the vegans' opinion is of insect food, because that's being pushed a lot now, isn't it, as the food of the future?
Yeah, it is the food of the future.
Mm. But that's an animal, isn't it?
It is.
Because they don't like honey is non-vegan, isn't it?
I don't understand that.
No, I don't.
That terminology.
Good.
Harold, you're muted.
Thank you very much. I'll start again. I just said, well, that seems to be all the questions that we got. So I'd like to just thank Robert for a fascinating talk, and we're looking forward to seeing the booklet that's going to be produced as a result of that. So can we show our appreciation in whatever way we want to? Virtual claps, yes.
Thank you, everyone. I hope I'll see you at the honey show.
Good. Well, I'm going to stop the recording now, everybody, and then I'll close the meeting. Thank you again, Robert.
Thank you.
Really